So it's my pleasure to introduce António Costa Pinto, who now has the floor.
Hi. Hello. Thanks very much. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I'm going to be brief, since after a day and a half of discussions about fascism, neo-fascism, transnational fascism, radical right, populism, etc., we are a bit tired. But the first point I would like to make is the following. A couple of months ago, I read a very interesting article, as a matter of fact, a very short article, that tests the use of several concepts connected with the radical right. Fascism, radical right, populist, radical right, okay. And he goes, it's very easy, as you know nowadays, and he goes to the last 45 years of academic journals, and he tries, to find a pattern of the uses of these concepts to analyze the extreme right, radical right, neo-fascism, fascism, populist right, populist, radical right. And he finds a very interesting pattern and I will be very brief. From basically 1945 to the early 70s, the buzzword was the extreme right. So the majority of the academic journals, history, political science, political theory, dealing with right-wing extremism, the word was extreme right. In more politicized journals, mainly associated with the left of the political spectrum, not exactly 100% academic journals, but journals like let's imagine the New Left Review and others, etc., and other journals, more connected with the public space in the political debate. Neo-fascism was sometimes there for very small groups. The groups we love in a way. Say clearly neo-fascist, blah blah blah, all the parades, the paramilitary dimensions, and then, of course, in the last 10 years, the concept of a populist radical right came into the forefront of the academic debate on this new wave, let us say, of radical right-wing movements. Unfortunately, he decided to look at academic journals. But let's look at the press, for instance. Lisa Pastorini just left. She was an activist and left-wing intellectual in the 1960s, writing on third world, struggles in Africa, etc. For her generation, the military coup of Chile in 1933 was what? Was, of course, a fascist coup. Fascism was the word to characterize the majority of the military coup, for instance, in Latin America in the late 60s and 70s. Just to introduce, a very banal reasoning, a very banal statement that we don't own concepts and they float in the political and intellectual life. So fascism came back, even if, in this case, academic journals will tend to characterize Trump and Vox and Le Pen and reform in the UK, or other movements, or Madame Meloni in Italy as the populist radical right way. So I would like to make a sort of a tour. Ben, invite me to speak a bit about Latin America, and I think we can have an excellent view of the era of fascism from the periphery of the era of fascism. But let's not forget that many things that I'm going to say in debate are also very useful to analyze the era of fascism in Europe. Because, of course, we tend, it's obvious, we tend to look at Nazi Germany and Italian fascism as the main diffusion centers, what I could call, and some social scientists call, let's forget the other concept. Diffusion centers of fascism are National Socialism and Italian fascism as forms of political regimes, but also as extremist type of political movements. But let's not forget that even in Europe, 80% of the dictatorships of the era of fascism didn't follow that pattern. Smetona didn't follow that pattern. Dollfuss didn't follow that pattern. Metaxage in Greece didn't follow that pattern. Salazar in Portugal didn't follow that pattern. It's not that they take over the power of a fascist, radical, stereotyped fascist movement. And I could give many other examples. And that's the case of Latin America. First, in the case of Latin America, when we look at the culture of the political elite in the interwar period, there is a sort of preemption of the radical right, anti-democratic, anti-liberal democracy, let us say, first wave of democratization in Europe and in the Western world, especially in Latin America, by conservative social Catholicism. But let's be careful, because Greece was not a Catholic country, and Metaxage did try to institutionalize a political regime with some elements of fascism, and of course, as you know, it was not a Roman Catholic oriented country. But the most important point I would like to make, that it's the case of Latin America, where you have in the political culture of the radical right in the 1930s, is a blend of conservative social Catholicism, and where there is a group of reactionary intellectuals in France associated with the Action Française that are going to play a central role. They're going to play a central role in Latin America. They are going to play a central role in many other inter-European, interwar, conservative and reactionary political culture, where Maurras, for instance, was probably the main, let us say, theoretician of this alternative to liberal democracy. Now, I'm going to be very brief. First of all, Latin American Eurofascism knows the reduction of liberal democratic regimes, basically through military coups. Is it so different from the majority of the European experiences? If we exclude, of course, the most important, Nazi Germany and Italian fascism. Francoism is the product of a conservative military coup that fails. And in the Civil War, of course, a small radical group of fascists do start playing an important role in the reactionary coalition that supports Franco and the takeover of power of Franco after the end of the Civil War, with the support we all know of Nazi Germany and Italian fascism. But let's not forget that around 60% of the authoritarian takeover of power in the era of fascism are the product of conservative military coups, not exactly of a fascist, let us say, takeover of power. And that is going to be the case of Latin America. Now, when we look at these regimes, these movements, I will go very rapidly to fascism. What we see? we see that basically, I don't have the time, of course, to develop this, but I've been doing some research with a group of historians on the topic. What are basically, when we look at diffusion centers of National Socialism and Italian fascism in the global interwar period, in the global period of the so-called era fascism, what kind of models are dominant? We must admit that National Socialism as a political system is not exportable. Nobody cares. The political culture of National Socialism, of course, the racist dimension of national and anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic political culture of National Socialism, undoubtedly. But what about National Socialist political institutions? Who is going to try to adapt National Social political institutions? Not a single European dictatorship in the interwar period, from Japan to Chiang Kai-shek to Salazar to Franco. Simply because the German National Socialist political system, this polyocracy of the system, is not exportable. Italian fascism, yes. Personalization of politics and the leadership principle is there. But the point I would like to make is that Italian fascism has three important characteristics in terms of institutions that everybody is going to try to adapt. Not just to adopt, but also with specific adaptations. And that's what we call social and political corporatism, a new form of political representation, alternative to liberal democracy, based on organic principles of political representation. And of course, social corporatism. Everybody knows what corporatism was. More Catholic, less Catholic, more fascist, less fascist. And finally, Manolescu, a radical right politician in Romania, wrote two central books, as a matter of fact, in French, Le Parti Unique and The Century of Corporatism. And he was right, The single party, more or less fascist, in the majority of the cases, a non-fascist party. The majority of the single parties of the European dictatorships of the era fascism were not fascist parties. As a matter of fact, many of them did illegalize fascist parties. From António already during the Second World War till Salazar, even Franco did control the fascist component of the party. But the single party, yes, extremely important. So let's. So in Latin America, as in many parts of Europe, as a matter of fact, you have basically two diffusion elements of the era of fascism, two regimes that are very important. The Italian fascism and what we could call a sort of a third authoritarian way that is characterized, for instance, very clearly from Dollfuss regime, Salazar, even Franco, that later on, of course, during the Second World War, many of these regimes are going to be forced to adapt to National Social domination. That's the case of Tiso. What is Tiso? Tiso is a Catholic priest. He is the builder of the institutions of the Slovak state. Later on, of course, we know that the Slovak state is going to be Nazified, tra virgolette. But that's a product of the imposition or conditionality of the National Socialist occupying power, not the product of, let us say, national elites. The same happens in Hungary. The Fascist Party of Hungary, as everybody knows, it's put there by National Socialist Germany in the very last 6 months of the Second World War. So many of the regimes we are going to see in Latin America do have European correspondents. In the case of the Iberian Peninsula in Latin America, of course, they are mainly Catholic. And contrary to the common belief, or everybody in a way knows that, for instance, the Portuguese new state is going to be the stereotype, let us say, of a Catholic dictatorship, conservative reactionary dictatorship, with, of course, inspiration from many institutions of Italian fascism. I'll be very brief. So let's look. Wow, what happened here? Yeah. So when the New York Times journalist in 1940 goes to Latin America and you look at the majority of the conservative dictatorships in Latin America, from the Brazilian new state to many others, he suddenly realized that they mainly supported, like conservative Catholics, that sometimes even use the Salazar dictatorship as a reference and as a model. But come on, sorry for this, come on. But, you know, what about Vichy France? What about Vichy France? Is Vichy France dominated by the 3 or 4 minor fascist parties? Yes, in the very end. Oh, but Vichy France is not an institutional product of National Socialism, but of a conservative, as a matter of fact, very reactionary French radical right with a very clear humus of Action Française and others. The same happens with Horthy Hungary, with Vargas Brazil, as I was mentioning, or the Greek. So I wrote a book about it. So give a look at. I'm not going to develop this. It's a majority. You don't even recognize these names, like Uriburu or David Toro or all the other candidates of dictators in Latin America in the interwar period that follows the Iberian pattern in a way. Uriburu basically is a general who tries to emulate the experience of General Primo de Rivera in Spain. General Primo de Rivera, before the Spanish Civil War, got a lot of inspiration from some institutions of Italian fascism. But it's not fascist. It happens. Because the diffusion of political institutions doesn't mean that you are going to create a typical fascist regime as Italian fascism. So I just want you to point out the 3 institutional dimensions, because they all try to create first a single party that in the majority of the cases is created from above. But that's what Dollfuss tries to do in Austria with the conservative Christian Socialist Party. That's what Pilsudski tried to do in Poland. That was the 3 Baltic dictatorships tried to do in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. That's what Metaxas tried to do in Greece. And that's what these Latin American dictators tried to do in Latin America. With the implementation of social corporatism, we know, let's forget now Manolisco and everything, or an alternative type of representation. To give you just an idea, since we are floating, in a positive way in these concepts, for instance, the Carta del Lavoro of Italian fascism is emulated by 90% of the interwar European dictatorships, who emulates the equivalent of the German case. 2 or 3 already during the Second World War. La Carta del Lavoro brings the main principle in terms of, resolution of the social problem, anti-communism and anti-liberal democracy. It's almost paragraph by paragraph, from Bolivia to China, to Salazar, Portugal, the Catholic dictator, to Franco, Spain, to Vichy, etc., etc. And then, of course, you have these corporatist chambers based on organic principles that are on the base. The Brazilian new state is a very interesting case for two reasons. First, because Brazil has the most important fascist movement in Latin America, much more important than Mussert, minor fascist party in the Netherlands, or even the Norwegian National Assembly, who gets 1.5% of the votes, and that's it. A minor a fascist party in Norway that, of course, once Norway is occupied, tries immediately a coup d'etat to collaborate with National Socialism. As a matter of fact, that Hitler rejects. Quisling will come to power later on, but not exactly in 1940-41 when they decided to open this. So Brazil has the most important fascist party of Latin America. Immobilize elites, immobilize masses. We were discussing, I think there was a question about, this Brazilian national identity conceived by the Brazilian fascism. And because, and that was the case, Brazilian fascist movement was not racist in that sense. It was the other way around. The new Brazil is the new nationalist Brazil. The new Brazilian national identity is based on exactly the multicultural dimension of Brazil. Immigration, plus black slaves, or former black slave, etc., are elements. So, but that's the case of the majority of radical nationalism in Southern Europe and in many other, as a matter of fact, Latin American countries. But what is going to happen to, in this case, to the head of the Brazilian Acción Integralista, is going to exile. It tries a coup against Getúlio Vargas, the dictator of the Brazilian new state, and he is condemned to exile. The same happens to the Portuguese fascists. As a matter of fact, Salazar sent them to exile or forced them to integrate. And in a way, the same is going to happen to many fascist movements, small fascist movements in the interwar period, that in some cases are going to be co-opted by occupation authorities, especially in case of German Europe, because they played an important role. But in the majority of cases, they will not be in power. That's the case of Netherlands, that's the case of Belgium. And even that's the case of Norway, if we accept the year and a half, where Quisling has political power in Norway. So in the case of Brazil, what we have? First, and that's something we tend to underestimate, the role of very important intellectual politicians that sometimes they don't belong to fascist parties. They are important members of the elite, they are jurists, law professors, conservative law professors who play a very important role in the design and the capacity to import institutions from Italian fascism and try to adapt them to local circumstances, like in the case of Brazil, like this, for instance, this Francisco Campos, who is the main ideologue of Getúlio Vargas. So they have constitutions very similar to the ones of Salazar or to the ones of Metaxas or others. This is a bit, how Brazilian new state looks like. The same we could say in Peru, the second most important fascist movement in Latin America, the Unión Revolucionaria, that is also going to be illegalized later on. I could give you many other examples in Latin America, from Colombia, etc., etc. So, second point that sometimes we tend to underestimate, I think, I might be wrong, but I think, in process of political change associated with the radical right in the 20th century, that, the international arena is central sometimes to analyze changes. So the first wave, the first authoritarian wave in Latin America, it's basically the same of Europe. It's the end of the Eurofascism. The majority of the fascist parties are dissolved. The majority of these dictators, the simple reason is they don't have allies. They don't have a process of transitional justice. They don't have épuration. They don't have transitional justice. They don't execute fascist leaders and authoritarian leaders. Their Pétain, because they don't have a Pétain, they have just a national Pétain and not a Pétain under German rule. They don't go to jail, but they go into exile, and they almost disappear in 1945. But when you look at Latin America, so we have a very strong diffusion of social and political corporatism, personalization of politics, many very important intellectual politicians, single parties, and regimes that are not very much institutionalized. What is the main difference, in a way, from Europe? Is that in the late 30s, the US started playing a central role in Latin America. Not just in terms of, an international power, but in relation with institutions of Latin America. And the point I would like to make is that, in a way, the Second World War means the end of the main connections with Western Europe, both in terms of political elites, in terms of cultural elites, and in terms of models of political regimes and strategy. Why? Because after the Second World War, during the Cold War, you are going to have a new type of political regime in Latin America, whose links with the cultural dimensions of fascism, even if we use the concept of fascism as a very broad type of, cultural construct, it's weak. It's weak because, first of all, we have a regional and not a global way. The military dictatorships in Latin America are a regional phenomenon, not a global phenomenon. We are not talking about, Japanese intellectuals going into Nazi Germany and vice versa, or going to Italian fascism and participate in this cultural humus of fascist movements, even if in the majority of the cases the Japanese who go to visit Germany are not fascists, are technocrats and members, of the authoritarian elite. But anyhow, let's forget it. We have a regional and not a global way. Second, because the Cold War in the United States offered Latin America a new type of national security ideology. And so the locus of power in terms of the radical right comes into the military. This is a list of countries who suffer military coups. So what kind of regimes are this? And we tend to forget, because we are always, in a way, obsessed with fascism in terms of fascist movements, when the majority of this autocratic way of the interwar period comes from military coups and from civilian, in this case, or civilian military authoritarian leaders. Let's not forget that Franco is a military, that Pilsudski was a military, and many others. I'm not going to discuss this anymore. And secondly, in 1973, Chile, in a way, represents the stereotype of the new type of radical right authoritarian regime in many parts of the third world. Fascism. Just simply do a content analysis of the majority of the European newspapers and even intellectual outlets of the European left, and even sometimes of the right, but in the majority of cases of the democratic left, and the new form of let's just say, a fascism came through the military with a national security ideology, strongly anti-communist and anti-left. But military dictatorships are very different from fascist dictatorships. First, because the decision-making is within the military institution. Secondly, because they have a weak ideological apparatus. The majority of these military dictatorships are anti-communist. They express conservative values. But that's it. They don't create political institutions. They use neo-fascist groups in Latin America to kill members of the opposition, sometimes even anti-guerrilla type of militias. But they are, and that's very important in my opinion at least, they invent in a way the most incredible institution of clandestine terrorist repression organized by a state. And that's the case of Argentina, that's the case of Chile, that's the case of Uruguay, that's not exactly the case of Brazil, but almost the case of Brazil. When you have clandestine forms of political repression that are much more, in a way, terrible than Italian fascism, as a matter of fact, ever did. Italian fascism, well, I'm not going to discuss this, but when you look at the thousands of political opponents that are eliminated in a sort of a clandestine political operation with, of course, the ideological support of an anti-communist and anti-democratic, of course, type of political left. So I will forget Argentina. Then you have blends of regimes, like in the case of Brazil, where you have authoritarian civilian elite with the military. You don't have a personalized dictatorship in Brazil. Every 4 years, the dictator is replaced by another one, first. Second, they maintain formal liberal democratic institutions. They even have, as nowadays competitive authoritarian regimes like Corbyn and others, they maintain a sort of a limited opposition within, in formal terms, democratic institutions. Sometimes they even organize semi-competitive elections. Like in the case of Brazil, who has a dominant party, and of course the Communist Party is illegalized, the majority of the extreme left parties are illegal, but they maintain a sort of semi-loyal, let us say, opposition, to use the concept of someone, a Spanish political scientist, Lins, that was quoted here in the paper of our colleague who was dealing with Spain. So Brazil is a very interesting case. I will be very brief, even because just a couple of reflections on our topic in a way. In the case of Latin America, let's forget now Latin America, it's clear that in terms of political regimes, in terms of ideologies, in terms of cultural links, Latin America says goodbye to Europe and links with the US became much more important. Of course, not of the, May 68 extreme left, but many other factors that I'm not going to develop cut the links with Europe. The Cuban Revolution, etc., etc. The US support to military dictatorship, it's the end of the typical cultural links. In the interwar period, the majority of the radical right Latin American intellectuals came to Spain, came to France, came to to Italy, absorbing, the traditionalist, neo-monarchist, Maurasian type of reactionary political culture. The same with fascist Italy. Very few, with the exception, of course, of the German communities in Latin America. Very few from national socialism. So in a way, we go from the era of fascism to the Cold War, from the interwar fascist and radical right politics to military dictatorships, and then, of course, there is a global unifying wave of democratization that comes in Central and Eastern Europe, in Southern Europe, in Latin America, and many other parts of the world after the third wave of democratization. Just to conclude one or two, reflections on our topic. The major difference between what we could say interwar era of fascism and the current radical right populist wave, it's not connected with geography because it's a global wave. We must admit that it's not because of Trump that the Portuguese radical right comes from 1% to 23%. Portugal, with the typical topics of law and order, crime, immigration in a country where, at least since the 19th century, with on an average of 20% of its population immigrates, first to Brazil, then to Germany, to France, to the UK, to Luxembourg, to Australia, whatever, to Rhode Island, to... So we are facing undoubtedly a global radical right populist wave. Does fascism, historical fascism, plays, I think, a role? It plays a role in terms of what we could call, as the French, I think, an air de famille. An air de famille, because there are many elements that are simply there. Not exactly associated with the groups, quite frankly, who went into the Congress with, this minoritarian radical groups we like so much to take a picture of. Not at all. Mainly concerned with very deep reactionary conservative values. Because in terms of populist radical right mobilization, in terms of social policy and in terms of economic policy, they are quite diverse. We can discuss this later, but what unifies Vox, regardless of the regardless of Trump as a personality, but what unifies Trump, Vox, Madame Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, the Swedish populist right, first, is not a question of origins. Origins are a trap. The Swedish radical right-wing movement comes from a neo-Nazi movement. Right, okay, right. It explains a lot, it doesn't explain a lot. In the case of Spain, it comes from the center-right. In the case of Portugal, it comes from the center-right. In the case of Bolsonaro, it comes from a politician that is in the Brazilian Congress. Since the 1980s, the late 80s, nobody knew what is Bolsonaro. We are talking about an electoral popular revolt against liberal democracy and the capacity with conservative values to mobilize them against the political class and the oligarchic class of liberal democracy. Bolsonaro was just by chance a captain, a captain of the Brazilian army. Who could care about Bolsonaro in the Brazilian army? Just 15 years ago. So first, I think, we must be careful with the trap, I think, of the cultural origins, because the pattern seems to be a sort of a strong group of conservative values. In terms of social and economic policy, they couldn't be more diverse. But there is no unity. We could say that there is some unity in terms of a new protectionist wave, anti-globalization, anti-financial capitalism. Yes. But the main, I think, I don't think, it's quite clear. The main new characteristic that resembles in a way, especially the takeover of power in the interwar period by very few regimes, but those who count, Italian fascism and Nazi Germany, it's because they are a product of electoral politics and mobilization in electoral terms within a liberal democratic framework that once in power starts to try to subvert democratic institutions, as is the case. And finally, to conclude, in the interwar period, there was what we could call diffusion centers. Italian fascism, Nazi Germany. Can we say that the current populist radical right wave has a strong diffusion center? Is Trump that explains why Bolsonaro went into win elections in 10 years ago, or Giorgia Meloni, or in Austria, or in France? That's another fascinating, I think, new element on the current, let us say, radical right or neo-fascist, whatever wave. There is no diffusion center as in the past during the fascist era. Okay, thanks very much.
So I would have questions of my own, but I will yield to the floor first. Mario Kessler.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this illuminating lecture. Illuminating because I used to live in Columbus, Georgia in 2009, 2010, only a few hundred yards away from the School of Americas, which I was never allowed to enter in. The School of Americas was basically the training center in the United States for many of these military actors who later became part of the military dictatorship apparatus in different countries. And what I learned is indeed the guidelines were not basically oriented on European fascism. neither were they oriented on American Ku Klux Klan racism, which was in this area very strong. But the guidelines were based on fight against communism, against communist conspiracy, which was seen as the main threat to the Western world with all its values. Yeah. So this enabled people, this enabled anti-communist people to join these services, yeah, without defining themselves as fascists. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Of course, I agree with you. As a matter of fact, I didn't have the time to challenge the opinion, for instance, of our colleague from Oberlin College when he was saying that, for instance, Franco's Spain during the Cold War was an important transnational agent of fascism. Not at all. Franco is most important in the interwar. Well, the Spanish fascists more important in the interwar periods. In the 1960s, they were not important at all in terms of a transnational hub of fascism or neo-fascism, or, it was simply not there.
Amber?
This is a question from one of our Zoom audience members, so I'm just going to ventriloquize. You seem to make a distinction between fascist ideas and fascist actions by suggesting that Italian fascist ideas were emulated by figures who don't end up becoming fascists. Would you make a similar distinction between anti-fascist ideas and anti-fascist actions?
That's very... It's not easy. Yes, of course. Well, first of all, let's not forget that anti-fascism was basically the product of very diverse coalition, formal coalitions of political groups, members, and ideologies. And anti-fascism is a product of the era of fascism. The concept of anti-fascism, that's very interesting. We tend to be, in many ways, Eurocentric with the concept of anti-fascism. But it's used again, Chiang Kai-shek in China. It's used in Japan, although, in a very minoritarian way after the Second World War. Is a central concept, for instance, in transitional justice after 1945. Many of the Asian collaborators with Japan are condemned by anti-fascists in the name of the collaboration they do with fascism. But of course, anti-fascism as such, it's basically a coalition of very diverse families of the political left and sometimes even of the center-right, that in Italy goes from, Demo-Christians to communists and to socialists and other. And the same happens. That's interesting. The same happens, and that's what would make sense of many military dictatorships in Latin America, is that they provoke a sort of anti-fascist movement as a coalition of pro-democratic and sometimes anti-democratic. I'm not going to discuss now that the main target of the communists was not exactly to establish in the 1930s a liberal democracy, but to establish another type of political regime. But they are a part of the anti-fascist, political dynamic. Yes.
If there isn't an immediate other question from the floor or the internet, I have a couple. And one of them would be from your last remarks about the fact that what we now lack are diffusion centers. And I wanted to ask you to clarify how diffusion centers work, because the institutional nature of connections required at that technological, if you like, or communication level might be different from today. And you said Trump, Bolsonaro, Meloni would not necessarily have precedence or mutual influence. And I kept thinking that the prior models would be Erdogan and Modi.
With Modi.
Or Erdogan.
Yeah. Yes and no. What I mean by the absence of diffusion centers is, let us be clear. For instance, the international communist movement did have an institutional diffusion center. It was the Soviet Union. Cuba, it's a wonderful example of the 1960s. They didn't have a communist party. Well, they did have a small one. Even Castro was not a communist. But 10 years later, what you have in Cuba, it's a socialist dictatorship political regime. The same, the same in Vietnam, or the same in many other. And it's true that in the era of fascism, when you look at Italian fascism once consolidated in power, not the fascist movement, not the social origins of Mussolini, the socialist patati patata, the nationalization, the first, rah, rah, but fascism in power. And undoubtedly, we find a lot of intellectual politicians, of dictators, etc., going into Italy to try to adopt. We can't say there is a very important. I like his work very much, quite frankly. Stephen Levinsky and Lucan Way are two political scientists. One, Levinsky from Harvard, who were lucky enough to be quite. I will do it. I will be short. They invented this concept of competitive authoritarianism. You probably, even if you read the New York Times, this concept of competitive authoritarianism is always there. To define Orban, to define Erdogan, for instance, in Turkey. And nowadays, the US is going to become a sort of a competitive authoritarianism, patati patata. The concept was built based on third world authoritarian regimes. The reason why this concept was coined was because after the third wave of democratization, when the US was a promoter of democracy, the European Union as well, some Africans started to liberalize a bit their dictatorships and to organize, even Russia was the typical competitive authoritarianism with the dominant party, not exactly free elections, but semi-free elections, And nowadays, apparently, competitive authoritarianism is becoming the pattern of this new radical right populist regimes, from Orban to what Bolsonaro did. Now, in India, I'm not sure. I don't think, but I might be wrong, I don't think Indian democracy as such has been already perverted in the semi-democratic way. Maybe yes, I'm not sure.
Every election has been rigged and no paper ballot has ever...
right. Yeah. In that case, it will probably follow the pattern of competitive authoritarianism. But what I mean by the absence of the diffusion center, you don't have for the moment. You might have the states, the United States, in the future. I'm not sure. All this idea, for instance, to intervene in Brazil. You do bad things to Bolsonaro, pow! 30% more in tariffs. Regardless of the style of international relations of Trump, he might become a sort of a diffusion center. But I have I have serious doubts about it.
Amber.
This is in my own voice now, and picking up the same question about diffusion centers as sort of a subpoint, I wondered when you were saying it whether the lack of identifiable diffusion centers has more to do with the media revolution.
With?
The revolution in media.
Yeah.
That the mechanisms of diffusion are now online. And if we were to look for centers of diffusion, it would have to be nodes in networks of who are the people talking to each other and how, and tracing those kinds of connections. And that, if that were the case, it would explain why there seems to be this feeling of things seeping up or coming up from out of nowhere that are similar in different places, clearly related, but without any obvious sort of pattern of diffusion that we used to be able to trace.
I quite frankly, I don't have an answer for that. That's one of my holes, in a way, is that communication, social networks, the new role in politics of this kind of... I have a problem there because of, I don't feel comfortable, both in theoretical and empirical terms, to answer to you. One thing is certain, we have authoritarian experience that survive quite well. That experience. China survives quite well. We tend to forget that China is a case of an authoritarian regime that in transition from a socialist dictatorship to a state capitalist authoritarian regime, and very stable, very stable, with their own, levels of communication, etc. At the same time, for instance, when we look at the evolution of the Russian political system, the concept of competitive authoritarian, it's simply not there anymore. Russia is a full-fledged authoritarian regime. It's like a dictatorship. There was, I'm going to conclude, the Russian journalist who wrote a very curious book, I must admit. She's not an academic, she lives in New York. And she was basically, this problem of the old typologies of political regimes now, when you said nationalism, tack, tack, personalization of politics, blah, 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 to characterize political regimes. And she was using some definitions of fascist regimes to characterize Russia. And Russia was simply there in 90%. Conservative values, for sure. Nationalism as the main engine of political mobilization. A single-party regime, personalization of power, lots of other dimensions. I'm not talking about Italian fascism in historical terms of National Socialism. And she would say, well, this is our fascism. This is our form of Russian fascism. We live in a very uncertain type of crisis of liberal democracy, and I don't think we can answer to many of the questions that we tend to put to ourselves.
Susan.
Perhaps I've entirely failed to understand you, but I have not yet heard an argument for why that kind of argument would be wrong. You laugh as if it were obvious, but for those of us who are not specialists in comparative fascism, those are all very good questions, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand you quite well. Why?
You refer to this book from somebody who you rather condescendingly say is not an academic. I don't know who it is.
This Russian journalist.
Correct.
Yeah.
And you quote her without giving arguments for why her questions are wrong or misleading. And I'm very puzzled. It may be obvious to those of you who are specialists in comparative fascism. For those of us who are simply trying to figure out the world that we live in, which seems in many ways to be careening perilously towards fascistoid, if you prefer, structures, those are all very good questions. So if you could quickly give me an argument to why that's dismissible as you dismissed it.
I didn't dismiss, in a way, it's the other way around. I was trying to add to the conceptually, floating debates we have in the present. It's difficult to characterize some political regimes because, for instance, that's what I tried to say. In a way, she's right. Characterizing the current Russian regime as a form of fascist regime because it fits the model. It sounds,
So why is that laughable?
It's not laughable. Unfortunately, it's not laughable. It's just an example of how difficult it is, I think, in my opinion, to find good instruments to analyze the present kind of crisis of liberal democracy. With one difference: when we talk about Russia, we talk about a country like China, etc., who didn't suffer a process of democratization. Let's not forget that. So it's not a crisis of liberal democracy. There is a point that I think is probably the main difference, and that is the most challenging, I think, for us to analyze. I've been discussing this with lots of colleagues. Why liberal democracy, and especially the center-right of the political spectrum and the left, lost communication with the lower segments of society, with what in the good old Marxist approach to politics could be not just Marxist, the petite bourgeoisie, but that's a fact all over the Western world. That for me the most puzzling dimensions.
Okay,
2 weeks ago, just to conclude, 2 weeks ago, we all know this, but it's important. Let's imagine that the UK was not a majoritarian system with a very specific party system. Let's imagine the UK as Portugal or as Spain. Who could win the elections in Britain? A populist radical right party, the Reformists.
So there's one last question. We should keep it short because we're just over time. Richard.
I'll make it is.
We have the elites. We don't have the masses.
It's coming back to the exchange between Susan and António about Russia. I don't have anything definitive to say. I just have a gloss that might be helpful in the same way that throughout António's presentation, he was distinguishing between these regimes that after World War II in Latin America were repressive, were maybe competitive authoritarian for the most part, but weren't really, echt with the kind of Urfascismus that, what's his name, Umberto Eco talks about.
Yeah.
But quickly, one could make the same kind of argument for Russia. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a Russian political scientist scholar, but in fact, the far right in Russia didn't accede to power. Putin was directionless in terms of ideology until he discovered that Ukraine was fascist circa 2013 and 2012 when he almost lost the election. So he knew he had to do something. And then all of a sudden it was, he was going to go for this concept that had been floated by Russian far-right nationalists in the early 2000s already of Novo Russia, Greater Russia.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of traditionalist conception, but it's in the 21st century. But you know, people try to make these arguments about, like Timothy Snyder, Ilyin, who are his ideological mentors, Putin, or Dugin.
Yeah, Dugin.
You know,
yeah, of course.
whom I would like to be as ideological mentor, because I've worked on Heidegger, and then I could be, you know, a talking head or something. But that doesn't work. None of that really works. I mean, he did take certain, you know, bits about Eurasia. That was.
Yeah.
So one could make a similar argument. I don't even know if it's helpful, but that the ideological extremists, the convinced fascists in Russia, he didn't want those either. I mean, it's more, you know, they have this notion in Russia, of course, of the political technocracy, the way they look at politics, kind of top down, and you know, authoritarian, but with certain techniques and trolls, whatever. But you know, it is its own thing. I mean, I was fortunate. I went there. You can't go there anymore, really, risking your own. In when was it, 2015, 2017, and it sounds like a cliche, but you have to be there, and you realize, where am I? You're not in Europe. You're not in Asia. You're in something that's in between. In fact, I mean, it's its own entity. So I think one has to figure out Russian politics in those terms. I mean, even Dugin's Eurasia BS. I mean, he you know, plays with Heinrich Himmler and SS, etc. They play with these terms, but it is kind of like an Anspielung. You know, and even the National Bolshevik Party, that didn't work. I mean, it makes sense, you know, national communism, but that didn't fly in the 1990s. Anyway.
Thanks very much.
All right, so we close the session. I invite you all to thank Professor Pinto. Thank you.